You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussion, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Laughlin.
Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone, on a Wednesday evening. Christos Anesti. Christ is risen. I am going to be joined here in just a moment by Father Deacon Anthony. He's an Eastern Catholic deacon. He's been on before. Y'all are familiar with him. Really good guy. Very, very helpful when it comes to explaining material in Eastern Catholicism and other things for that matter. But we're especially going to be focusing on the East, of course. And in particular, as the description of the video is going to tell you, infant communion, so Paedo communion. Which is a topic that is long overdue for this channel. So I'm excited about that, and I'm in fact going to go ahead and bring them on here right now, coming up next. Father Deacon, how are you? Good to have you back on the show. Oh, I think you might be muted. Try to unmute there if you don't mind.
There we go.
There you are. Yeah, how are you?
Oh, fantastic. I'm a little tired. You know, the Holy Week is pretty exhausting for priests and deacons. I had a lot of long liturgies, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So Monday I collapsed. But it was a great experience.
Y'all have a whole lot more of a liturgical role in the East than a Latin deacon, right?
Yes, in the Byzantine tradition especially, deacons do a lot during the liturgy. In most cases, we have more lines than the priest does.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a lot. So, I can imagine you're tired here, so I really appreciate you coming on and doing this because, like I said, this is a topic that's really been long overdue on this channel. I've let people know what my view is on this, but you're going to give us a much more informed perspective here. So I look forward to your comments. I mean, I'll just let you take over it. What are some of the things that we should know when it comes to, first of all, the history, and then, where do you land on this particular issue when it comes to infant communion?
Sure. So the history of it is pretty fascinating. Most people are not aware of this, but infant communion was the norm in the Western Latin Church up through the 12th century. As a matter of fact, the way it worked in both the West and the East from very early on was that if a baby was going to be baptized, that baby would be baptized, the baby would be confirmed, and then the baby would receive first communion, all as one action. It wasn't even looked at as separate things. It was one full initiation. There weren't even separate ceremonies for the three. They all always went together. And it was that way in both the Western Church and the Eastern Church up through the 12th century. In the 12th century, things changed. And the history is a little fuzzy, but from what I can tell, two things happened in the 12th century that caused this to change. The first was there was a movement, especially in the Western Church, to have greater reverence for the Eucharist. And again, that's a positive thing. That's a positive thing. But this emphasis upon the supernatural aspects of the Eucharist, while a positive thing, it entered into the realm of scrupulosity in some places. So there became a concern about the spilling the precious blood, or children spitting up the host. And keep in mind, infant communion typically involves the baby having precious blood placed on his or her lips or within the baby's mouth, right? That's how we do it in the East. So in the West, in the 12th century, they became worried about sacrilege from that. So at that point, they kind of moved away from letting anybody drink the chalice because they were worried about it spilling. But the other thing that occurred at the same time was there was a new theology developing about spiritual communion. And the idea was that receiving communion spiritually was in some cases perhaps just as beneficial as receiving communion physically. That was never church teaching, but that became a popular sentiment in the 12th century. So when that happened, first of all, most people stopped receiving communion. People were afraid to go to communion. They feared the wrath of God if they were not in a perfect sinless state. So most people were too afraid to receive communion. And then secondly, they came to see spiritual communion as being just as beneficial. So they didn't, in many cases, people didn't see a point in going to communion. And it got really bad. So by the time the 13th century rolled around, again, through much of the West, not everywhere, but by the time the 13th century rolled around, you had a situation where in the Western Church, Catholics would go to Mass and they'd watch everything up until the point in which the priest held up the host, right? At that point, they considered that their moment of spiritual communion. They call it ocular communion. They'd visually see it, and then people would just file out of the church and leave. People would just leave right at that point. And that was a problem, and the church knew that was a problem. So that's why when you get to the Fourth Lateran Council, towards the beginning of the 13th century, they actually had to put into church teaching a law that everyone must receive communion at least once a year. It was an obligation to go to communion once a year. But what's interesting is the language of it. The rule from the Fourth Lateran Council says that once you reach the age of reason, you have the obligation to receive communion once a year. And the reason they mention age of reason is you only have an obligation if you have reason. If you're not able to do enough reasoning, no obligation applies to you. So what the language is that once you reach the age of reason, you have an obligation to receive communion once a year. People took that language of age of reason and they began to misinterpret it as meaning you couldn't receive communion until you reach the age of reason. But really, that's not what the Fourth Lateran Council is saying.
Right.
What it's really saying is that once you reach the age of reason, you have an obligation to receive communion.
So no later than the age of reason. Right. So you could receive up until that time. Is that accurate or incorrect?
No. What it's saying, what the Fourth Lateran Council is saying is that once you achieve the age of reason, you have an obligation to receive communion once a year. But before that period, there's no obligation. But it was not meant to be restricting communion to people who've achieved the age of reason. That was not the intention of that at all. It was meant to force people who are at the age of reason to receive communion once a year. So what's astounding about this is right up until the 12th century and through part of the 12th century, your Roman Catholic person in the West would typically be baptized, be confirmed, and receive First Communion in that order all at once. And that was the norm throughout the West, right up through the 12th century. And again, that fact really astounds people, but I've done some research into this, and there's plenty of evidence. There's even writings from popes talking about the importance of infants receiving communion the whole way through. And it's only in the 12th century that this dramatic change occurs.
Wow. Oh, and by the way, I think I was hearing a little bit of feedback or echo or something in the background. If you could just turn the speakers down slightly.
Sure, I can do that.
But
is that better?
Let me make sure that you can still hear. No, I can hear it though. Are you still able to hear me though?
I hear you just fine.
Pretty well. Yeah,
so you're getting feedback, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm hearing it. It's a little better now.
Let me see if I can adjust this a bit more here.
A little bit. Oh, now it's really loud.
Oh, that was me adjusting the volume on the thing. Is that any better?
Testing 1 2 3.
Testing 1 2 3.
I think we're good now. So we'll
right.
keep it at that. So yeah, that's an interesting point. So and I like that you noted, and maybe if you can expand on this a little bit, that this was kind of born out of scrupulosity in the West. Do you think, not to go too far off track here, but do you think that scrupulosity also impacted some other things, not just infant communion, but maybe even the withholding of the chalice from the laity and things like that? I know there's other things going on with that too, but
I think the scrupulosity was one of the things that resulted in the chalice being withheld from the laity. Yes. And there was a lot of fear surrounding that. For better or for worse, people were afraid of various things involving communion. And, part of it's the attitude about what communion is. Is communion to be seen as this powerful awful thing. And by awful, I mean not bad, but awful, right? Something so powerful and majestic that being around it is a moment of danger, or is it to be seen as medicine? A medicine that's meant to cure you of your illness. Those are two very different ways of looking at it. Up until the 12th century, most people, both in West and East, saw it as medicine. Yeah. We're sick. We need medicine in order to get well. And communion was received as medicine, as a way of healing us spiritually. But in the 12th century in the West, they saw it less as medicine and more of this object of power that you had to approach with dread. And if you weren't in a perfect state, you could possibly be bringing doom upon yourself. Very different way of looking at communion than how it was historically.
Do you think that both of those aspects are really historical? Because, I mean, you can see Ignatius of Antioch really early on talking about the medicine of immortality, so you see that aspect there. But you can also see there in St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 this idea that you don't approach the chalice unworthily, otherwise you're eating unto condemnation. So it seems like both of them are there. It's just that one might be emphasized more than the other. Is that the case?
Yes, the balance was thrown dramatically out of whack. So the whole idea of being worthy to receive communion, you find it right in the writings of St. Paul. But there's a distance between not being worthy to receive communion and communion being something that you can never be worthy to receive, or if you are, it's a very rare occasion. On one hand, we have to make sure we're spiritually prepared to receive communion. We shouldn't be, in a state of tremendous sin when we go to the chalice to receive. But at the same time, nobody is ever really worthy of communion. When you think about it, we're all in a state of sin. Even if we went to confession the night before, I guarantee you've sinned in some way. You've fallen short in some way between then and the moment you receive communion. No one's really worthy to receive in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, but I mean, there'd be a fundamental difference between receiving with grave sin on your soul versus, venial. And
exactly.
And it seems like they took that principle from the caution that's there to be given for whenever you have grave sin. And it seems like they took that and applied it into maybe venial sins, and that might be where the scrupulosity is coming in.
Yeah, they applied it to pretty much everything.
Yeah. So it goes too far. Now, let me ask you this. What exactly are the benefits then of an infant receiving communion? Because we would affirm that a person who receives the sacrament of baptism has eternal life. So what is this infant receiving? I mean, obviously they're receiving the Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity. But practically, what are they receiving that they don't already have through baptism?
An extra source of spiritual strength. And an important one, right? An important one. So when a baby receives communion, that child is being strengthened in a way that's very valuable. We may not always see the results, but it has a transformative effect on the child. And, for us who are adults, we have to be concerned about being in the right disposition to receive. And if you're receiving communion every week and you're shut off from God and you're pushing away God's grace, it may not impact you that much. But if you're a person who's receptive, who's trying to follow God's plan, communion can be transformative for you. When you think about it, children are already in the perfect state to receive communion. They're innocent. They're already in a receptive mode. So when they receive the Eucharist, it can be very powerful in transforming them.
Now, for those of us who are in the Latin West, since we don't have the practice anymore, we got rid of it. On the flip side then, are our infants in danger? Or would you just say that they're just not as well prepared, perhaps, as if they were to be given communion? How would you view them?
Okay, my personal preference is for infant communion, obviously. But that being said, the Western Church, I don't think infants in the West are in any danger. And I don't think that they're not being prepared in a way to face the world in the way that Eastern children are. I wouldn't say they're at any real disadvantage, but at the same time, I would say that there's a source of grace that they might be missing out on, possibly. But again, I'm not going to tell the Western Church what to do. But it is interesting that this whole withholding of communion from infants wasn't something the Church consciously decided to do. It was really an accident of history when you think about it. And curiously enough, infants were still receiving communion up through the 16th century in some parts of the West. It didn't all happen at once. Things were more chaotic back then, not as centralized. So like in parts of Italy, kids were receiving communion up through the 16th century in some places. But what happened was in 1910, Pope Pius X, he saw what happened, which was the children weren't receiving communion until they were, in many cases, teenagers. Because we talked before about the order of sacraments. Originally, for the first 1,200 years in the West, the order was baptism, confirmation, and then communion in that particular order. And when infants stopped receiving communion, around the same time, it became the norm to delay confirmation. Up until then, it was very common for infants to be confirmed, receive First Communion. From the 12th century on, you see confirmation being delayed and then communion being delayed. So in 1910, Pope Pius X saw this, and he felt strongly that children should be receiving communion. So he issued a decree. But in that decree, he goes over the history of all this. And the stuff that I told you, he pretty much says the very same things in his decree. And you kind of get the sense that he feels this is unfortunate that this happened, because he talks about infant communion in the early church. He talks about infant communion in the East. And he then says, well, and here in the West, we're giving communion to 12-year-olds for the first time. And he moves the age of communion down to age 7 in the West. And his intention there is to try and get closer to the way it used to be. But again, when you read his decree, it's clear that he probably would have been open to going further, but at the same time, he had pastoral considerations to keep in mind.
But the problem is, it seems like we're not even doing it at 7. In some dioceses, they're receiving way past 7. Is that
First Communion?
Yeah,
I was not aware of that.
Well, I mean, let me rephrase. Not First Communion, but confirmation. I apologize. Confirmation. But
yeah,
but I see them as going hand in hand. So
they do.
When I think of the others. So what do you think about this practice of having First Communion at age 7, but then delaying confirmation until 16 or something like that? What do you think about that?
And again, this is my personal opinion. I have no interest in telling the Latin Church what to do, but my personal opinion is it's unfortunate. The historical order always was baptism, confirmation, and communion. When Pope Pius X moved First Communion down to age 7, it didn't affect confirmation. So confirmation stayed at a later date. At that point, the order of sacraments got kind of messed up compared to how they were historically. And interestingly enough, if you look at church documents, even today, it always mentions them in the original order: baptism, confirmation, communion. What we're experiencing now in the West is more of an aberration in the grand scheme of things. Only since 1910 has First Communion come before confirmation. So I know that a lot of Roman Catholic theologians, even some Roman Catholic bishops, would like to restore the original order of the sacraments. I know that at this point, I believe about 13 dioceses in the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, about 13 Latin dioceses, have restored the original order. And what they do is they will have the child get baptized as an infant, and then at age 7, the child will be confirmed, and as part of the same ceremony, then receive First Communion. That's a trend that seems to be picking up steam slowly, but it seems to be picking up steam. And people are looking for a way to bring back the original order and to try and restore, the sense that the sacraments are something that you receive as a free gift, rather than being something that you earn. And that's a whole other issue. But with confirmation, I think that's a threat that some people see. There's a lot of fear that confirmation is treated as if it's something that you earn. So I know, for example, some dioceses don't confirm until age 17, some confirm 12, some confirm at 13. But typically, you have to sit through a bunch of classes. In some cases, you have to pass a test. In some cases, you have to do hours of community service or service projects to be confirmed. And the fear that I've seen some people in the West express is that that's giving the impression that confirmation is something you earn, when really it's a free grace given to strengthen you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now, let's shift gears a little bit, if you don't mind. Would you maybe talk about the biblical and also historical, maybe early church fathers, precedent for infant communion? For those who are watching who think that there's no biblical support and there's no patristic support, what would you say?
Mhm. So, when talking about biblical support and when talking about patristic support as in the first and second century, we run into the same problem that we do with infant baptism, which is there isn't a lot written about it either way in the scripture or in the first century of Christianity. In the second and third century, we see more evidence of infant baptism. We see more evidence of infant communion. So we can be pretty sure it was that way either from the beginning or very close to it. But you don't see anything explicitly written about it until the second and third century. But again, there was no reason to write about it in many cases. You know from arguments about infant baptism that in the scripture it talks about apostles baptizing entire households. And these are households where you can presume there were children. It doesn't say that the apostles baptized the adults in the household. It says it baptized the entire household. And more than likely, then, those same people received communion, probably in a different way than we receive it today, but they were receiving communion also. And it would seem logical that the children would be receiving also. But again, it's hard to say anything with certainty from that period because there just isn't any documentation.
And maybe what about some early fathers like Augustine? It seems like he does talk about infant communion, but if I recall correctly, I think he's of the opinion that unless an infant receives infant communion or communion, they're deprived of heaven, if I recall correctly.
I believe you're right. It's been a while since I've read his texts on this, but I recall that being the impression he gives. And interestingly enough, I found writings from popes, from fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh century, using language that's rather similar to that. One pope in particular is talking as if you deprive an infant of communion, you're depriving the infant of salvation, which is pretty strong language, especially considering the practice in the Western Church today.
What do you think should be done in the West? I know it's hard to comment because you're Eastern Catholic. You don't want to tell the West what to do, but just in your opinion, what do you think could be done to restore this practice?
I'll speak from experience. It's a hard practice to restore. And I'll tell you where my experience comes from in this. So I'm Eastern Catholic. My church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, has been in communion with Rome for roughly 500 years, a little bit longer than that, perhaps. During that period of being in communion with Rome, we often found ourselves in a situation of wanting to mimic Roman Catholic practice. This, we call it Latinization, right? When Latin practices are adopted by Eastern Catholic churches. And this is something that's frowned upon by Rome. This has always been a problem. Eastern Catholics sometimes see the larger Western Church. They see the things the Western Church does, and they see things that the Pope does in Rome, and they think, well, the Pope's doing it, maybe we should do it. And they start imitating those practices. And then invariably, Rome would intervene and say, wait a minute, you guys need to be Eastern. You need to maintain your Eastern practices. And they would tell us to stop mimicking them and be authentically Eastern. It's an interesting dynamic, right? So one thing that happened at a certain point along the way, some of the Eastern Catholic churches stopped giving infant communion because they wanted to mimic Roman Catholic practice. They wanted to do what the Romans are doing. And this caught on in a lot of places where you'd have baptism and confirmation, chrismation as we call it in the East, and then you'd wait and do first communion at the age of reason. And that happened in a lot of Eastern Catholic churches. And in the 1800s, you had the Vatican intervening and saying, stop doing this, restore your original tradition. In the 20th century, it became even more intense. And then finally, by like the late 20th century, Rome is basically giving orders, restore infant communion now. And they're pretty adamant about it, like really, really strong about it in their documents. So in the late 1990s, a lot of Eastern Catholic dioceses began to restore infant communion. And when this happened, it caused some tension in certain places. And the tension is not for the reason you'd think. It wasn't that people felt that infants shouldn't be receiving communion. The big issue was they wanted to have a party when the kid received First Communion. They saw that as a special event. They wanted to have on the little white dresses and have all the gifts and everything, and the aunts and uncles coming in for it. That became a huge source of conflict. And it took a long time to bring back infant communion in the East for that reason. And again, nothing to do with theology. It was about wanting to have the party. In many places, the way they resolved it was by making a big deal out of first reconciliation. So they would have first confession at age 7. The kid would receive the sacrament of reconciliation. And then afterwards, they'd have a big liturgy in which all these kids who received reconciliation for the first time would wear their little suits and white dresses and receive First Communion for the first time after reconciliation. And that would be the big event, and have the party after that. And that's, a compromise that seems to have worked in a lot of places, although some Eastern Catholics don't like that because they still see that as mimicking Latin practice. But at least the sacraments are occurring when they should. So one big obstacle in the West, I think, would be that loss of the First Communion celebration. People are really attached to that, more so than many of us realize. However, the benefit of losing that situation and having infant communion restored in the West, is that people would stop thinking that First Communion is a sacrament. And I encounter this a lot too. I teach theology at a Catholic college. You'd be surprised how often my students grew up believing that First Communion is one of the sacraments. That's, of course, a misunderstanding. But if you stopped having that, perhaps that misunderstanding would go away.
What would you say to those who would argue that, in order to receive the body of Christ, you have to discern what you're receiving, and an infant doesn't discern, so it's not fitting that they receive as an infant, but it's more fitting that they receive at the age of 7. Maybe not required, but just more fitting. What would you say to that?
Right. What I would say is arguments like that against infant communion can just as well be applied to infant baptism. Some would say that you shouldn't be baptized until you can make the choice for yourself, that it's more fitting to be baptized when you make the choice for yourself. What I would say is that that's an argument with some merit. If somebody believes that a person should not be baptized until they can decide for themselves, I can see an argument for that. If somebody believes that a person should not be confirmed until they can decide for themselves, I can see an argument for that. Same thing with withholding communion until the age of reason. I can see that argument, and I can see the merit in it. But at the same time, I think there's a lot to be said for giving a child as many graces as possible at a very young age.
There's a group of Protestants known as the Federal Visionists. They tend to be Reformed, Presbyterian bent, and there's a group of Presbyterians that argue just that. They say, look, we accept infant baptism, but then we want to say, you're not supposed to have communion for the infant because the infant can't discern, but then doesn't that apply to infant baptism too? But we baptize infants. So they want to argue based on the argument that you just gave, and that is, if we're going to be consistent, we would have to take away from infant baptism. And I always thought that was a very persuasive argument that they offered. So before I even became Catholic, I maintained the view of infant communion and never really I understand the Latin practice is valid and there's nothing evil there, but it's not the best, I guess is how I would put it. I've never felt the most comfortable with the Latin practice. Your thoughts on that? Would you put it as saying, okay, it's not evil to withhold, but it's maybe not the best practice?
I would say, from my perspective, it's not the best practice. From my perspective, that being said, Maybe there's a reason why God has it that way in the Latin Church. Maybe
Right.
God has a larger plan and there's some
Sure.
reason for it to be that way.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, providentially, God has allowed it. And providentially, God has allowed all kinds of things in the Latin West, but then some of them are being rolled back. I mean, like
Mm-hmm.
withholding the chalice from the laity. I understand how this developed historically, and I also understand that at least at one point it was there to combat the Utraquists, but most of us
Yes.
aren't Utraquists and combating Utraquists anymore. So the chalice was restored after the Second Vatican Council, and I think that was actually a good thing, although there's some abuses taking place, sure. But
And that is an interesting point, because
yeah,
it was, the withholding of the chalice that actually excommunicated the infants, right? When you no longer had the chalice, that's when the infants stopped receiving communion. When the chalice was restored after Vatican II, some people thought it would be a logical progression to bring back infant communion at the same time. But again, things get
yeah.
entrenched.
But, we at least brought that one back, so I kind of wonder in due time if we're going to end up going back to the right order of things and doing it at the right time. I know it would be something that would have to happen gradually, but I just kind of wonder if that's the trajectory we're heading in as far as
It might be, a lot of Latin theologians and bishops even see the value in the Eastern practice, and they realize it's the original Western practice. Quite a few see that. But another obstacle is there's a sense in the West that you have to have a carrot dangling in front of the kid, otherwise the kid will leave and never come back. And I've seen that. I remember when I was in high school, I had friends who went to CCD because their parents promised them that once they're confirmed, they would never have to go to church again. And they would go to CCD, and then they get confirmed, and then they would never return to church again. And it was dangled like a carrot, right? And there's this fear that if you don't have confirmation at this age or first communion at this age, that the kids will leave the church and never return. And that is a concern in the West. But I can say from experience in the East, we confirm our kids as infants, first communion as infants, and I don't think we're losing them at any greater rate than people are in the West.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to the East and your parishioners or visitors, let's start with the parishioners, then we'll actually talk about the visitors. We'll do those separately. Do the parishioners generally understand the meaning behind it, or is it something that you've kind of had to catechize them in as far as infant communion?
It generally requires some catechesis.
Mm-hmm.
It generally does. And part of it is here in the United States, we live in a predominantly Western society. Where we're surrounded by Roman Catholics. So Eastern Catholics sometimes don't understand why we do things the way we do, and it's necessary for us to educate them, because otherwise they just kind of imbue the Roman Catholic thinking because it's all around us.
Now, visitors, what is their reaction when they see infants receiving communion during the liturgy?
If they're not prepared, by prepared I mean they're not acquainted with the East already and have done some reading, usually they're pretty surprised. I've had them tell me that they were legitimately surprised when they saw a 6-month-old receiving communion. But once I explain the reasoning to them and how it's our tradition, they're usually pretty receptive and understand why we do it.
Any negative reactions?
I've never seen a visitor have a negative reaction to it, not in my experience. Now, I did see negative reactions from older Eastern Catholics who grew up during the period in which we were mimicking the Latin practice. And this was like in the 1990s, when infant communion was restored in a lot of different parishes and eparchies. Some of the older Eastern Catholics I knew were pretty upset about it. They just couldn't accept that a child was receiving communion. They had a hard time understanding it, and they had a hard time accepting it as being legitimate.
What was the rationale behind that?
I received first communion when I was 7. That was the rationale,
Okay.
And they had fun. They had fond memories of having their first communion class,
Okay.
and all that. So the argument was really, we've done it this way as long as I was alive. Why are we going back to some older practice?
Yeah, I imagine. But now, have you had people come up to you and say, Wow, that's a beautiful thing. I'm really impressed that y'all give communion to infants. Have you seen the flip side where you've had that
Absolutely.
positive?
Many times. I've seen many visitors come who are impressed by that and think it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that I figured. I mean, I didn't think most people would react negatively to it, but I felt that most people would probably receive it well. Well, anyways, if you wanted to go ahead and address any other topics with infant communion, I'm going to go ahead and start asking everybody. Send some chat questions. Make sure to put it to @Reason and Theology. By the way, if y'all want to call in, I can set the phone up. It is 1-800-484-3801. If you want to call in for your live questions, we can do those as well. Just maybe let me know in the chat if you're going to be calling in. And in fact, I'll just go ahead and get it set up right now just in case. But let me know anyway if y'all are going to call in. We'll do live chat questions. Otherwise, just do them over here in text form. Again, make sure to send it to @Reason and Theology so I can distinguish it from, your comments between each other. But yeah, Father Deacon, if you wanted to take it away with any other comments before we get to the chat.
Yeah, regarding the order of initiation, baptism, confirmation, and communion. One thing that's unfortunate that I've seen is there's no uniform movement within the Latin Church, within the Roman Catholic diocese. Here's an example. So 30 minutes from here is a diocese that in the 1990s restored the order of communion. So they moved confirmation from teenage years down to age 7, did it right before First Communion. And when they restored it, they did a lot of education. They had meetings with parishes, they put out literature, they really explained it to people, and they put a lot of effort into making this happen. And from what I could see, from a distance, it looked fairly successful. I was actually the confirmation sponsor for a young man who was 7 years old when he got confirmed in that diocese. And then what happened was that bishop retired. A new bishop came in, and he didn't like it. So he put everything back to the way it was before, and he moved confirmation back to age 12 or 13. And it created even more confusion and chaos among the people in that diocese. This is one of those things where I think there needs to be some sort of coordination or at least discussion among the bishops in the West. If they're going to restore the original order of sacraments, which I think would be a positive thing, they need to make sure that they're not canceling each other out and they're all on the same page, at least at some level.
I've experienced that same problem locally at local parishes, not in reference to infant communion, but just liturgical changes where, one priest is pretty solid when it comes to his liturgy ad orientem, and, he's pretty conservative, high church and all that. And then he gets shuffled around and bring in another priest, and he's pretty modern and even a little liberal, and he doesn't want to do any kind of ad orientem. He doesn't want to do anything high church, and so they'll flip it around. So I know what you mean. I've experienced that myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now it looks like we have a call here. Let me go ahead and greet you, caller. You're live with Reason and Theology, caller. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, sir. What's your name and what's your question?
My name's Kyle, and so my question is regarding infant communion. Is this also based on John 6 and the emphasis where Jesus says,
I'm not hearing him.
You can't hear him? It's pretty loud for me. Hold on. Let me make sure. All right. I turned it up significantly. Kyle, if you can repeat your question one more time there.
okay, so
Are you able to hear that, by the way, Father? Okay.
Yeah.
is infant communion almost viewed as an absolute necessity, as in the same weight as infant baptism? In regards to John 3:5 versus John 6?
No, not in the same way. So what's curious is we were talking earlier about St. Augustine and some of the popes up until the 12th century, some of them did talk almost as if infant communion was a necessity, but that was language that was stronger than what the church actually taught. But no, it's not viewed as a necessity. We would view baptism as a necessity, but not infant communion. It's seen as a wonderful thing. It's an important practice for us, but we wouldn't say that a Roman Catholic child is not going to be saved because he or she did not receive communion.
Any follow-ups there, Kyle?
No, I think that answered it.
Good. Thanks for calling in. I always see you in the chat. I don't think you've called in before, have you?
No, I haven't.
Awesome. Well, do it again. You're welcome anytime.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Good question there. So I do see a few here in the chat. This one is asking, does Father Anthony have any issues with Catholics changing rites? If so, what would be the reason? I haven't heard any good reasons yet.
I have no issues with that. I think today, in our day and age, people live in a society where all kinds of things are around us that in the past we would have never been exposed to. Pretty diverse world for the most part. So today, it's not uncommon to live in a city where you have Roman Catholic parishes, maybe Byzantine Catholic parishes, maybe Maronite parishes, Chaldean parishes. We're exposed to all of these things. And some people, for whatever reason, feel drawn towards something different than what they grew up with. And there could be good reasons and bad reasons. A bad reason would be that you think it's a little easier, if you switch rites, or you're trying to get around a rule or something. I've talked to people who are Roman Catholic who wanted to become Eastern Catholic just so they could become married priests. That's not really a good reason, in my opinion. But if you're a person from one Catholic tradition and you feel a draw towards another, and you feel that God is calling you there, and you feel a certain peace there, by all means, join that church. The language they often use is changing rites, but it's really changing churches. The rites refers to the worship and the theology and the spirituality, but as bodies, they're individual sui juris churches. So what I always recommend is if somebody visits a church from a different tradition and they like it, attend there for at least a year and see if you can live that way for a year. And if you find yourself at home there, then consider talking to the priest and doing an official change. But I don't see anything wrong with it. I did it myself. I was raised Roman Catholic. And again, I love the Roman Catholic Church. I still love it. But as a kid growing up, I visited local Byzantine Catholic parishes a number of times. I fell in love with it. It was so mysterious. It seemed supernatural to me. I just loved it. I loved it. And when I became a teenager, I started going more regularly. And then I got a spiritual director who was an expert in Eastern spirituality and the philokalia and whatnot. And when I was 21, I decided to go for it, and I changed rites. I became Greek Catholic. For me, that was the right decision because I felt that that's where God wanted me. He wanted me there for a reason. I don't know why exactly, but I really felt that I was being called there. It seemed strong to me. It seemed obvious to me that's where I belonged. So for me, I believe that's what I had to do. If I didn't do that, I'm not sure I would have been following God's will for me.
Now, when you made that change, was it pretty easy to do? Because I always hear it's pretty hard actually to go through that process.
No, it may have been hard once upon a time. Once upon a time, you had to get Rome involved, had to go through the Vatican and everything. But by the time I was exposed to Eastern Catholicism, it was a pretty easy thing. Basically, it's between bishops now.
Okay.
So, I attended a Byzantine church for a period of time. I got to be good friends with the pastor. He helped me write a letter to the Eastern Catholic bishop explaining my reasons for changing rite and why I felt I wanted to be a member of Greek Catholicism. And then the Greek Catholic bishop contacted the Latin bishop, and they just exchanged paperwork, and it was done. It took maybe 3 months.
Okay. Not bad at all. Yeah, because I still thought that you had to get Rome involved. I was
No.
unaware that had been dispensed.
The,
Interesting.
the only the only cases in which Rome has to get involved is if, for whatever reason, one of the bishops declines to let you
Okay.
change rites. Uh, if that happens, you can appeal to Rome. And that
Gotcha.
does happen weirdly in some cases for strange reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Like I knew people who lived in an area where the Roman Catholic bishop just would refuse every request to change rite. He would not let anyone switch to an Eastern Catholic church, no matter what their reasoning was. Now that's really, really rare. The vast majority of Roman Catholic bishops would not operate that way.
Mm-hmm.
But that one did for some bizarre reason. But that was years and years and years ago. The other reason I've seen people get refused, and this is silly and it'd be obvious that it would be a problem. I've known people who wanted to go from being Roman to Byzantine, and they'd write a letter to the Byzantine bishop explaining they wanted to become Byzantine because of a long laundry list of all the problems they had with the Novus Ordo.
Mm-hmm.
And the Byzantine bishop has to share that with the Roman bishop when they're transferring the paperwork. The Roman bishop sees that, and he may not want to let the person go for that reason. He may not feel that's spiritually beneficial for that individual. Or the Byzantine bishop sees that and says, wait a minute, I don't want this person in my diocese if all he's going to do is complain.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking long lists of, all the heretical things they believe was in the Novus Ordo.
Mm-hmm.
That's a one-way ticket to not being able to change rites.
Yeah, obviously. You would think that would go without saying, but yeah,
Yeah.
I imagine it happens a lot. Adrian Fonseca, he good guy. Shout out to him from Guadalupe Radio Network. In fact, he's with Catholic Drive Time. I was on there earlier this
Oh,
morning.
cool.
Yeah, so here's his question. What does Deacon think about refusing teens confirmation due to failing tests, missing classes, etc.?
Yeah, that's a tough one. On one hand, I'm not a fan of that approach because I think it does give the impression that you earn the sacrament. And that is not how we're supposed to approach sacraments. On the other hand, you want to make sure that there is some level of commitment. You want to make sure that it's not just emotion that the kid is going through that actually means something to the kid. So one could argue that if the kid just misses all the classes and blows them off, that the kid doesn't really understand the value of what confirmation is.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the kid is rejecting it in his or her own way. So I think there could be a reason for doing that. But at the same time, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of confirmation being something you earn. I think that's problematic.
Shouldn't be in that problem to begin with. Should have gave it to him as an infant, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's my opinion, but
yeah. I'm Latin Rite, and I share the opinion, so I'm in an awkward position. My son was baptized in the Latin Rite. We are temporarily attending an Eastern Rite parish and have been offered to have him communed and chrismated. Would it be prudent to do so?
My opinion on that is only do that if you intend on remaining in the Eastern Catholic Church long term. I know this happens. I know there's some people who are, members of the Latin Church will go to an Eastern Catholic parish for a while and decide to get their kid baptized, chrismated, and communed as an infant. But unless they plan on staying in that environment long term, I don't necessarily think that's the best idea. First of all, there might be canonical issues involved. The sacraments would be valid, of course, but there might be an issue of licitness with the confirmation because you really shouldn't be confirming kids from another church without permission from that bishop. So, and sometimes Eastern Catholic priests may not be aware of this, or they may not have all the facts of what's going on. But in general, you shouldn't be confirming a kid and giving the kid First Communion unless you have permission from that kid's hierarch, and that would be the Latin bishop. But if you get permission from the Latin bishop, sure, it can be done. But is it really prudent? My personal instinct is it's better not to do that unless you plan on sticking in the Eastern Church for a good long while.
Mm.
That's just personal preference.
Yeah. This one is from Mario, a little off topic, but it probably needs to be clarified for our Latin Rite brethren. Is Father Dragani a Catholic priest? Can you clarify Father Deacon for us?
I am not a Catholic priest. I am a Catholic deacon. But in the Eastern Catholic churches, deacons are traditionally referred to as father or father deacon. In the Eastern tradition, the term father is used more loosely than it is in the West. In the West, it's pretty much only applied to priests. In the East, the term father is applied to priests, it's applied to deacons, and it's applied to monastics as well. So a monk would also be called father, or a female monk might be called mother. The idea is you're called father because you're a spiritual father. You're helping other people to grow to adulthood spiritually. We're all born as infants. We grow up physically, emotionally, and psychologically, but we also need to grow up spiritually as well. And the person who helps you to grow up spiritually is your father or your mother. So that title applies to anyone in that role. So a priest would be father, a deacon would be father, a monk would also be called father. Now, oftentimes we use the term father deacon just to clarify deacons from priests. But if, as a deacon, somebody calls you father, you don't correct them and say, no, it's deacon, because in our tradition, deacons are called father.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you have any parting words or final comments and things that you wanted to get in there about this topic before we close here in a moment?
Yes. I think when dealing with this particular topic, we have to understand that both traditions are valid. In the Western Church, the way they do it is perfectly valid. In the Eastern Church, the way that we do it is perfectly valid. I think this is an issue where there needs to be mutual understanding and appreciation. Part of it is, speaking as an Eastern Catholic, the way we do things oftentimes causes confusion for people in the West. And sometimes our people get carried away by that confusion on their end. I remember dealing with a situation a number of years ago where we had a parishioner who had gone to our church, and he was going to a Roman Catholic elementary school, and he took part in their first communion. And they didn't realize that there was a problem with that. He put on a suit and everything and did the whole first communion ritual, even though he was receiving communion at our church every week since the time he was a baby. And part of it was on our end. We may not have explained it clearly enough. I think we did, but the other part of it too was the Roman Catholic school didn't really understand anything about us and how we do things. And that unfortunately causes problems, causes friction. My wife was raised Greek Catholic her entire life. She's always been Byzantine Catholic. She was baptized and confirmed into the whole rigmarole. Mm-hmm. But she went to a Roman Catholic elementary school herself, and she had a really hard time there. She remembers telling her teachers that she was confirmed, and they would correct her and say she wasn't. And she remembers being told she was crossing herself the wrong way, and it was a really traumatic experience for her. So when our children were born, she was pretty adamant that we not send them to the Roman Catholic elementary school because she didn't want them going through the confusion that she went through, which I understand. And I understand that you can't expect people to know everything about one another, but there should be some basic familiarity. Mm. And the fact that that's lacking troubles me. I think it's really sad. And, I may be looking at pie in the sky, but my dream is to see Orthodoxy and Catholicism reunite as one someday. I would love to see that. That'd be the top of my list of dreams, right? As long as we don't understand each other and appreciate each other, I don't see that happening. At the Council of Florence, for example, the bishops got together from both sides. They resolved all the disputes and they declared the schism over. But the people in the pews, well, there weren't pews back then, but the people in the parishes didn't know each other. They didn't understand each other, and it was rejected by the population of people, not by the bishops. And then the bishops followed suit later on. Union will never work unless we understand and appreciate each other.
Point well made. There is one final one here that I saw from Lorelei. What exactly was it that Father Deacon fell in love with that prompted his transition to the Eastern Church?
It was the Divine Liturgy. My earliest memory of it is being a little kid, maybe 3 or 4, and my parents took me to a Byzantine Catholic wedding. And I remember watching the bride and groom put the crowns on, watching the liturgy, marveling at the icons in the icon screen. And to me, it was like magic. It felt like a magical experience, like I was outside of this world. And then growing up, my next door neighbor, his family was Greek Catholic, and I went to church with them a number of times when I was a little kid. And again, every time I went there, it was so mysterious. It was so different. I didn't understand it, but man, it spoke to me. And I dream about it at night. I have dreams about the Divine Liturgy. And, when I got older and I looked into it more and more, I found myself just longing for it. And during that period, too, I was Roman Catholic. I was involved in the church. I loved it. But I just had this longing for what was going on in the East. And for a period of time there, I became frustrated with some of the Novus Ordo parishes I was attending, not because I wanted them to not be Novus Ordo, but because I was longing for that sense of mystery, that sense of the sacred being set apart that I always saw in the Eastern Church, and it called to me. So during that period, I felt like I needed to be where I could have that satisfied, and the place that was the Byzantine tradition.
Yeah, I think that's generally what attracts people to the East is the liturgy, and you got to give it to the East. They've done very well at preserving the liturgy,
Yes.
Much better than we have here in the West. So
We're good at it. We're good at it, but at the same time, too, we have to also understand that it's a whole package deal, and with it comes an approach to theology that's different, and also an approach to spirituality that's different.
Yeah,
and you have to be willing to embrace the three together.
right.
What we experience sometimes is people who come to a Byzantine church, they fall in love with the liturgy, but they don't understand or appreciate the theology or the spirituality. And sometimes those people find themselves very uncomfortable after a while. We have to understand that the three really go together. The Byzantine liturgy makes the most sense in the context of a Byzantine theological approach and the Byzantine spirituality. So to really be at home in the East, I think you need to be comfortable with all three.
Also, point well made, and I think that's something that most probably haven't considered. Well, worth exploring in the future if you want to come on and do it. I think that'd be fun talking.
I would love to.
Byzantine spirituality or any other topic that you want to do. I'd be happy to have you on again.
I would greatly enjoy that.
Yeah. Again, thank you, Father, for coming on, and we'll have you on again. We'll discuss some topics off the air. And everybody in the chat, thank y'all for your participation. Kyle, thanks for your call. It's good to hear you. Adrian, thank you for your comment there. Glad to see you as well in the chat. And don't forget to, of course, comment, like, and subscribe, and of course, share it on your social media, on your Facebook, and all that good stuff, on your Twitter, too. And also check us out, patreon.com/Reason in Theology if you want to support us. Till next time, God bless.